Yeah, so today is the last session of this, and then I'll start again in September. I don't want to tag down particular topics. It's too early in some ways, but somewhere along the line, I'll talk about technology and international affairs, as well as non-governmental organizations and international institutions. Those of you here are obviously not so germophobic as to have stayed away. Do not shake hands during intermission. You know, it's interesting. I mean, we last met 3 weeks ago, and the number of things that have changed in the world is just astounding, just absolutely astounding. But I do want to kind of, at least for the first hour, stick to the agenda that I had announced, which was this. I've talked about China, Russia, and the United States in this changing world, right? And today I was going to talk about everybody else. And so that's what I'm going to do for starters. I'm going to start in our own hemisphere. And first country up would be Canada. Canada has a population, roughly speaking, of California. And yet Canada historically has played an interesting and important role in world affairs, which is sort of below the radar. It's had various leaders over the years, Lester Pearson, Trudeau's father, and so forth, who played a fairly important international role. It's gotten fairly quiet more recently, but it's worth commenting that under the radar screen, in Canada, for example, you have the Training Institute for Peacekeepers of the United Nations, right? So that's just an interesting contribution to the world. There's a lot of criticism about peacekeepers in the Congo and other places, but the leaders of the peacekeeping, the generals, the various officers, they have a training program in Canada. Canada has also been at the forefront, and still is, to fund long-term research that's relevant to what Trump calls shithole countries. Because research in terms of vegetation, climate change, and so forth has to be fairly long-term. And for example, the U.S. tends to only fund short-term activities, like 2-year things. And Canada has put down a marker for funding more long-term things. At various times, it's been important in international negotiations, heading international institutions, and so forth. So it is, in some senses, hitting above its weight, historically has been. Then if you go below the border, you get to Mexico. And Mexico, of course, is a rather large country, which has actually, historically and contemporarily, played almost no role in international affairs, which is interesting, right? Because theoretically it could. A little bit in terms of oil and petroleum prices, obviously in terms of trade relations with Canada, the United States, in a kind of regional sense. But basically, Mexico is now welcoming the Chinese investments and so forth. But you know, for a fairly large country, not a large blueprint in international affairs. Then you go further south of the border, Central America, essentially no role in world affairs. You get to Latin America, and Brazil, which of course is a very large country, played a remarkably interesting international role outside the Western Hemisphere, because since Portuguese was its language, it played a fairly major role in the former Portuguese colonies in Africa. So Brazil did a fair amount of foreign aid and technical assistance in Angola and Mozambique until the current government came into being. But aside from that, it didn't play a major leadership role in South America. Interestingly, Brazil has all of a sudden become very important internationally, including to us, because of climate change. So here you get a new issue, which all of a sudden catapults a country into focus. In this case, a negative focus, right? Cutting down the tropical rainforest, doing massive harm to the environment. So even though, from an international perspective, you would say, well, Brazil is, a large Latin American country, but not of any particular interest to anybody very much. A little bit in Africa, a little bit of leadership now and then in South America, but all of a sudden we focus on a country which has newly become relevant. And that's a sort of an important issue, which is that countries who used to not play a more important role in the world all of a sudden are playing an important role because of new issues. Climate change, the virus, all kinds of things which all of a sudden catapult countries and makes it relevant, not just what they do internationally in outreach, but makes it relevant in terms of their domestic politics, all of a sudden taking on global weight, international weight. And that's in a sense a new phenomenon. Historically, when small countries have played some kind of international role outside their region, it's been on things like military, contribution to UN peacekeepers, things like this. But climate change, pandemics, and so forth resurrect those countries into potentially very important places. There really is no other Latin American country which plays a major role. I mean, Chile is a fairly industrial country. It has trade relations, as we know if we go to Safeway or Shoppers or anywhere else. Half the products we buy, grapes, whatever, they come from Chile, they come from Peru, but this is sort of low-level trade which didn't necessarily transliterate itself into some kind of international political role. Occasionally, there is a leader of a country, and this is a more general point, that an individual head of state can sometimes catapult their country, not because they're into international realm, not because their country is doing anything international, but the particular leader is. For example, when Bachelet was the head of the Chilean government, she played a more dynamic role internationally and called Chile's existence into attention. She now heads a UN agency, but she also was an activist. For example, the climate treaty, the Paris Treaty conference, if you recall, was meant to be in Chile, and because of the uprisings, it was moved to Spain, right? That sort of thing calls attention to a country and allows at least the leadership some leverage, whether it's economic leadership or political leadership. Then, and Argentina is always a mess. It doesn't play a major role. There are other countries really in Latin America don't play a major role. Then before we leave our hemisphere, there is Cuba. Now Cuba, as we know, is a tiny little country, 10 million people, I think, something of that order. Cuba has played a huge role internationally, not just because Castro and post-Castro have been a kind of a marker for political, socialism, communism, whatever anybody wants to call their various regimes, but because Castro decided to make his mark internationally to have some influence, and the way they did it was to spread physicians all over the world. The largest production of physicians serving internationally were Cubans, right? They were all over the world. They were all over Africa. They were all over Central America. When the current, dare I call him, dictator of Brazil took over, the Cubans pulled out their physicians. And Brazil, as a consequence, has a very difficult time if they're going to get this virus, because they're very understaffed because the Cubans were all told to go home. So in an interesting way, even in a sort of small area, you can all of a sudden have some fairly major influence. And it is difficult to sit in Santa Cruz and appreciate the scale of the Cuban medical establishment all over the world. Not every country, but, as I said, throughout countries that have a shortage of medical professions. So that sort of raises vaguely interesting questions for Cuba, and Cuba, therefore, was hitting far above its weight internationally. Because once you have sending those doctors and you're negotiating for 100 physicians to be sent somewhere, right? You, the government, can have linkages. And the linkages for Castro's were ideological linkages, trying to influence either the heads of state or left-wing politicians. Training for labor union leaders in various countries would come to Cuba. So remarkably, a small country that's an island out there played a rather dynamic and interesting role in the world. What does that illustrate? It doesn't just illustrate how, let's say, smart or clever or whatever Castro was, but rather how you don't have to be a physically large country or even a large economy for somebody to make a marker and make an important contribution in the world. Does that make some kind of sense? Okay, that's the Western Hemisphere. Let's then move on to Asia. Interesting about Asia, because you have the very industrial and competent and important economically Japan, which has been hitting way below its size and importance. Japan simply has decided in the post-World War II world that it was not going to be, it was going to self-focus on its own politics and economics, and it was going to focus on trade and having an impact on the economy worldwide. So Japan has been economically very important, internationally and in the region, but politically has had very little of a footprint in most of the world. Sure, there are little Japanese embassies here and there, and yes, Japan has taken more interest, let's say, in South Africa than in Nigeria or something of that order. We can talk about those details. But basically, Japan, for a major country in the world, and we think of Japan as a major country, has had very little international footprint outside the economic one. Then I should backtrack. Then you go to something like the Philippines. The Philippines has an interesting role internationally, which has not been a foreign policy role, but has been that such a large proportion of the Filipinos work overseas and send money back home. So the Filipino economy has been firmly lodged into its own workers throughout the Middle East, throughout Asia, throughout everywhere. Maids, health workers, I don't know, many of you might have been to Hong Kong one time or another. Hong Kong is just absolutely full of Filipino workers. If you go into the center of the city and there are bridges and highways on a Sunday morning, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Filipino women sitting, and men and children sometimes, in subgroups of the villages that they come from, having their Sunday day off, right? Has the Philippines had an impact on the world? Well, it's had an impact everywhere in the world that it's allowed for the economies to be operational. And that's as true in Kuwait or in the working population in Saudi Arabia as it is in Asia. So the Filipinos are all over the place, and it's absolutely central to the Philippine economy. Politically, have they played a role? Not besides that sort of thing, not really. The current Duarte and his government is raising eyebrows right now because, of course, the Philippines was allied with the U.S. through World War II and all of that. And the Philippine government has just decided to switch allegiances to China. So that's a new ball game out there, right? They've decided, never mind the United States, let us make an alliance with China, which becomes important internationally because of the China Sea and all the waterways and China's claims, which in some ways go into the territory of the Philippines. and the Philippines used to challenge China, and now it's not going to challenge China. It's going to work with China to keep these islands and these waterways firmly in the hands of China and the Philippines rather than some other countries whose territorial areas that might be. I know I'm covering, sort of rambling through this, but I just want to get a kind of global picture here. Then let's say you talk about the other coastal countries. Korea, I don't need to say a lot. Korea is, on the one hand, firmly aligned to the U.S., and its interests are essentially in East Asia, right? On the other hand, of course, South Korea is also trying to play an independent role of some kind. And so it occasionally does fairly strange things. You might have seen me with that strange green bag walking around. That was produced when South Korea tried to get the international soccer competition to be in South Korea. And they produced bags and so forth, and the former ambassadors ran all over Korea, all over the world, trying to get the vote for the soccer match. They didn't succeed, by the way. But that was sort of an attempt to put a marker in the world. And you can say, well, that's silly. What does that have to do with politics? But, you know, having world matches, having Olympics, having these kinds of things buys you political leverage and economic leverage. It's not just the games. It's the fact that you want to be recognized as a country that matters, and you want to then transliterate that into some international leverage. But basically, of course, Korea is important because of North Korea. Korea tries to limit its international activities to trade, to alliances, to security, and things of that order. Korea has tried, as a consequence, to play a more major role than its size would indicate in international institutions. After all, there was a Secretary General who was Korean. There are other activities. So they try, in some senses, to have a minor role, but it's not terribly visible. Taiwan, I don't need to discuss, but Taiwan in the past has tried to compete with mainland China for development assistance in various countries. So Taiwan went to various countries that were not left-leaning and tried to say, we can help you with development assistance, agricultural assistance, fishing assistance, and so forth, and to have some political leverage against mainland China. That's essentially petered out. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but I don't need to bore you with that. Then should dip down to Indonesia. Indonesia is surprising. Huge country, right? Very self-focused country. Historically, once upon a time, identified itself as part of the third neutral countries, non-aligned countries. We all old enough to remember the non-aligned countries. Sukarno was the president. Nasser of Egypt, their days. There obviously is no, non-aligned group out there. And once Sukarno left, there was no pretense of playing some kind of major international role. And so, Indonesia has lots of domestic problems, so its focus on domestic issues makes some sense. What throws Indonesia back into the global realm is terrorism. Because, as you know, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, right? Didn't know that? Yes, largest Muslim country. More Muslims in Indonesia than anywhere else. Yes, they're almost all Muslims, right? And, by and large, they are Sunni Muslims. But there are also Shiite Muslims, and there are also reasons for the young of Indonesia to become radicalized, given the domestic situation in Indonesia. So Indonesia has, in fact, had internal terrorists for some of the islands and some of those conflicts out there. But it's also sent terrorists to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. So one of the concerns of the US CIA and other countries is not that Indonesia as its central government is playing some kind of major role in world affairs, but rather that Indonesian citizens are spreading around the world, not in huge numbers, but enough to make a difference for various terrorist movements. So internal terrorism annexed with external terrorism has bounced Indonesia up to the interest of various governments in the West and the United States. So there again, you see, some countries, the political leaders have some leverage in the world on world affairs. Sometimes their economies have some leverage in world affairs. Sometimes terrorists and religious groups have some impact on world affairs. And the most recent addition to how you may impact world affairs is climate. And there again, Indonesia is very important, because Indonesia is cutting down its tropical rainforests as quickly as Brazil is, and has actually done it for a longer period of time than Brazil. So if you want to start listing countries which should be captured to change their environmental policies and the use of their natural resources in destructive ways for the environment, Indonesia all of a sudden jumps up, along with Brazil, into an issue of global interest. So then, am I missing countries? So then you get to Southeast Asia, by and large, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and so forth, obviously played a major role during the Vietnam War and all the rest of it. But nowadays, the leaders are primarily focused on their own countries and are primarily focused on their economies. And so on a global scale, their economies are fairly important. So, for example, the Chinese, as you know, have switched a lot of production out of China into Vietnam for many reasons. One being labor is cheaper in Vietnam than it's in mainland China, but also to circumvent American sanctions and tariffs. Right? So you can see countries all of a sudden pop up internationally as being more important because other countries are trying to circumvent us through some of these smaller countries. But other than that, not a kind of major footprint. You can argue that Vietnam has been reasonable after we napalmed all their forests in terms of environmental stuff. Laos less so, and Laos is slightly more important for environmental reasons, but it's a small country. Then you could, I'm scattering a little bit. Then you could look Malaysia, corruption, this, that. There are changes going on right now I won't bore you with, but essentially Malaysia hasn't played a major international role of one kind or another. Then you get to little, what's the little country down below? Singapore, yes. Then you get to Singapore. It's a city-state almost, right? So here I want to illustrate something else, which is a leader can make a difference. Singapore has no weight internationally, really, except for maybe waterways and shipping and so forth. But we probably would not have the law of the sea treaty that we have. I've talked about that in the past, a global treaty, which of course we violate, but anyway. The law of the sea treaty, very important, not just for water and fishing, but also ultimately for deep sea resources and so forth. Very complicated treaty, took years to develop. The person at the forefront of that happened to be a person from Singapore. So if if you are fascinated by the Law of the Sea Treaty and want to run home, want to read a book about it, what you will see is that Singapore was absolutely essential to getting all the pieces together, to bring expertise to the table, and so forth. So Singapore is an illustration where, on the one hand, the head of state, but on the other hand, even a specialist representative to an enterprise can all of a sudden put a country on the map. Right? No one who is not interested in law of the sea would recognize or even know how important Singapore was in this enterprise. But since law of the sea is one of the more important international treaties, it's not negligible. Okay, so it's a different kind of illustration. Then there's Burma, Myanmar. Well, theoretically, the lady, as she's been called, could have played a major role in global human rights, right? She was poised to do so. Nobel laureate, identifiable, visually identifiable, personally identifiable, living in a horrible military dictatorship, blah, blah, blah. Whatever she could do or not do in terms of the government in Burma, she theoretically could have played a role of a Mandela or a Gandhi or somebody. And she threw it all overboard, right? She appeared in front of the International Criminal Court. She defended it. Her defenders, on pragmatic grounds, you may want to argue with it, say, well, she has to compromise so that her party can get elected in the next election, and so forth and so on. But if one is looking for world leadership on particular issue, she was poised to play world leadership, and she blew it. So much for an individual who could have, but didn't. All right, you move along and you get to, I forgot about Australia. Yes, sorry about it. All right, backtrack to Australia. So forgettable. Australia is a little bit like the Wild West of the United States. So Australia tried for some time to play a role in management of China in the region. It essentially that fizzled out. Australia for a long time was reasonable in allowing immigrants into Australia, so that gave an example of how you, as an immigrant country, can be reasonable. Then they stopped being reasonable. But at the moment, if you were to say, what's Australia's role in the world, I suppose it's consciousness raising about the environment, right? Their government are also climate deniers. They didn't do anything about it. They're heavily dependent on coal. Haven't switched. They haven't done any of the things that a country should be doing. They're environmentally an utter mess. It can't be straightened out very quickly, but you can see the consequence of global warming in Australia and how absolutely horrendous the situation is. So there is a negative role model. A modern industrial country which could do something, which failed to do something because of stupid policies, and now is in the soup. But for the rest of us, should be a role model for Brazil, for other countries. You do that, and this can happen to you. Right? So yes, Australia. Australia historically has been pretty good about sending some of its soldiers as peacekeepers and so forth. But basically, Australia has not played the kind of role it could play given its population and industrial capacity. All right, I'm skipping some countries, but let's deal with, Bangladesh, India, all of that. Bangladesh, other than the fact that it makes the clothing that you get down at 21 cheap, and occasionally kills its own workers because the factories burn down, is a terribly overburdened, very large country. And it has never sought to play an international role other than in terms of its neighborhood, right? India, Pakistan, and so forth. Bangladesh is a country to watch, not because of anything that's necessarily happening this very moment, but things that are about to happen within even the next decade, which is massive environmental degradation. Because the guesswork is somewhere between 50 and 60 million Bangladeshis will no longer be able to live where they're living. And exactly where are they going to go? Because Bangladesh is at such a low watermark that even a modest rise of the oceans, right, will wash out a whole chunk of Bangladesh. So when environmentalists look at Bangladesh, they look at it not as Australia, isn't it too bad, but what in the world will 50, 60 million Bangladeshis do, and where will they go? Because they can't just go upland. It's a small and very crowded country. And on top of that, they're dealing with all the refugees from Burma, right? Because all the Muslim Burmese are over the border. They've absorbed about 1.5 million, maybe 2, depends on who you ask, people from Burma, right? Which has a much greater capacity in terms of land to keep those people. So they've been pushed in there. And the politics of Burma, of course, is terrible. There are lots of ethnic groups. The Muslims are not the only ethnic group that the central government is fighting, because Burma is made up of a core of Burmese with lots of ethnic groups living in what is modern Burma through colonialism. And they're fighting other groups as well. So Burma is an ethnic nightmare in terms of the instability of people there. So that ethnic nightmare is visiting itself onto Bangladesh as well. Then you get to Pakistan and India. I'm sort of skipping a little. The Pakistanis, of course, have nuclear capacity. The Pakistanis are a source of military and terrorist activities everywhere in their region, not least of which, of course, in Afghanistan. They're supporting Afghanistan. Why are they supporting Afghanistan? Because they don't want India to take root, right? So here you have now a monumental regional mess, which is getting worse by the day. You have Pakistan continuing to do its messy stuff and threatening its military might. You have India, which has an authoritarian leader. I know Trump loves him and he loves Trump. Did you notice, by the way, that the 10 million people didn't show up at Trump's gathering? And there were only 100,000 people, and 1/3 of them left before he got through speaking. And another third left when Modi came up, right? Nevertheless, we have a nasty nationalist Hindu government in India, and its new laws, which allow other Muslims to come to India, and doesn't allow Hindus or anybody else, Buddhists or whatever. I'm sorry? It doesn't allow Muslims. I'm sorry. I'm out of it. By not allowing Muslims from neighboring countries to come in, what is hidden underneath it all is that many Muslims in India don't have the right kind of papers that they can prove that they're citizens of India. And so many Muslims in India are afraid that they too will get kicked out. So you have something of international proportions. And of course, other countries, for example, the United States, could exercise some leadership there. If the American president had gone over there and said to Modi, you know, you have a democratic constitution, and you're not honoring it, and put the weight of the U.S. and the European Union behind what's going on, maybe they could have done something about it, or at least mitigated it to some extent. Instead, Trump gets up there and says Modi's doing wonderful things and he's democratic and this and that and the other thing, while millions of people, not just in the surrounding areas, but also in inside India, are at risk for losing their what they consider to be, I mean, they're born there, they've lived there for generations, and they might get kicked out. Not to mention what Modi has done in terms of Kashmir, which does have some international standing because it was under UN supervision and so forth. So if one wants to look at an area of a very large country which is creating an utter mess in its region and wondering whether international forces will get involved, this whole India business is very, very dangerous. Okay, that's internal. External, up until now, it is amazing that the most populous country in the world, India is now slightly more populous than China, by the way. It's gone slightly above China, and it will continue to do so because of its population growth. India has not really played a major international role in the last 40, 50, whatever years, which is interesting, that you can have a country as large as India, right, without the government seeking to play a major role by choice. India has one of the smallest diplomatic capacities, very few foreign service officers, very few, their equivalent of their State Department is minuscule compared to the size of their country. So here you have some countries which hit way beyond their economic and population, and then you have a country like India, which had chosen all along to really, really be not an international actor, either in its region in a major sort of way, aside from the Hindu Muslim. So it's the biggest country with the least international capacity in the world, which is really interesting. And you can, it's just like our State Department. You can't get rid of everybody in the State Department or half the people in the State Department and then say, well, all right, we have a new president and he or she will now rebuild the State Department. It takes a long time to get this experienced diplomats ready to be ambassadors, knowing the countries and the languages and so forth. So India's very modest role, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but very modest role. It's the biggest, weakest international actor on a global scale that is a large country. I won't belabor Afghanistan. I suppose we're getting out of Afghanistan. Will Afghanistan play a major international role? No, except for maybe terrorism. It's interesting. Do you all remember, or some of you remember, there was a Senator Aiken during the Vietnam War who just said in the middle of the mess in the Vietnam War, why don't we just declare victory and go home and be done with it? This is a losing proposition. And everybody thought it was funny. Well, if somebody, essentially we've said we're going home. It's not that anything in Afghanistan has been resolved. It's just really, we're going to leave, right? I mean, that's one way out. But in any event, Afghanistan will continue to be a mess. So then let me quickly, having skipped some countries, move to Africa. No African country has played a major international role since colonialism. You have had leader, Julius Nyerere, tried to play a role. Nelson Mandela played a moral role while he was there. But as countries, those shithole countries, have been so busy doing their own thing that while they may be, one may be more important than another in terms of the economy, for example, oil for Angola and Nigeria and so forth, basically as political actors, the continent has been as quiet as Latin America, essentially. And as we also know, Africa will become increasingly important in the next few years for two reasons: environmental reasons, and related to the environmental reason, population movement reasons. Because out of the two, moving to maybe to 3 billion people living on the African continent by the end of the century, given today's technological knowledge and today's erosion of climate change, millions of Africans will also have to move out, right? So the idea that you see all the refugees and everything moving around the world. The fact of the matter is the Africans are moving not because they really want to live in Italy or someplace. They're moving because their farms are no longer productive, their plants no longer grow because they don't have enough water, and therefore they need to move on. Well, this will accelerate, right? So what I'm saying is, up until now, the continent as a whole has not played an important role. In the future, it is going to have a major global impact, and we better watch out in terms of what they're doing or help them do better at this point so the things don't get completely out of hand. The Middle East is a mess. It's a separate topic, really. What's interesting about it is, again, historically, what countries have played an international role or not. For example, Egypt, whatever its little role in the Middle East may be, and in Egypt, is not a major international actor these days, making a marker at international institutions, so forth. On the other hand, when Nasser headed Egypt, Nasser was a major international actor. He was part of the non-aligned group, and people paid attention, and you watched the evening news, or you listened to Edward R. Murrow, or whatever, and you saw Nasser holding forth on various international questions, communism, capitalism, socialism, decolonization, all kinds of things. That has gone away. So Egypt is a good case in point of a major actor once upon a time, where you see leadership rather than the large population and its economy and so forth being the major actor. Ditto in North African countries. Occasionally a leader rears his or her head, and then they play some kind of role, but not major, regional actors, but not major actors. In the Middle East in general, Lebanon has always been more important than the little country it is. And what goes on in Lebanon has always been of more global interest for reasons most of you know. We can talk more about it. And then, of course, there's Israel, right? Well, Israel, Israel is hard to talk about because if you're critical of Israel, you're in fact, not anti-Semitic, or you don't want Israel to exist or something. It's a very hard topic, especially in the U.S., to talk about, because it is a menace in the region for everybody, but nobody really knows what to do about it. And the consequence of it really is that Jordan and Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East are stuck, in some senses, having to focus on Israel and the neighborhood, and can't very much deal with the outreach. There is, of course, the question of inreach, which is what makes, from the perspective of the United States, what makes the Middle East important and also very expensive, is, of course, the largest chunk of our overseas military budget goes to Israel. It's absolutely out of range from any other part of the world. And it's taxpayers' money, right? So if we would reduce our military budget some, not just to Israel, but in general, we could, build our bridges and highways and have education and healthcare and all those things. I'm beginning to sound like Bernie, but I don't mean to, and I'm not going like this. But it's also the spin-off of Israel, which has global reach, and that is, of course, that the largest number of refugees, Palestinians, anywhere, are in fact in Jordan. And Jordan is a poor country. And while the previous king was king, he played a fairly major role in negotiating over the Middle East and other areas. Now that sort of visibility of Jordan has faded, and the unfortunate side effect of that is that Jordan heavily needs to be supported in terms of its refugee population, because it's taken in millions of refugees. I mean, more or less the population of Jordan is more and more Palestinian rather than Jordanian, right? But many of these people are still refugees, and they need to somehow be supported. So the international community needs to support that. So Jordan is still in everybody's vision as a receiving country of international help, which is a spin-off off of the Israeli-Palestinian mess of one kind or another. Which raises a kind of more general question, which I won't backtrack to all the other countries, which is that one of the big international issues besides climate change is, of course, increasingly refugees. And the question is, who is willing to take in refugees? Some countries are very generous. They are allowing refugees to come in. Then you get a situation, for example, that's in the news, of Turkey and the refugees from Syria, right? Well, the refugees from Syria are by at least 1 million, right? Well, Turkey won't let them in. Well, Turkey is being nasty, yes, on the one hand. On the other hand, Turkey already has 4 million Syrian refugees, right? So then Turkey says, okay, now in the last couple of days, we'll let some of them in, we'll send them to Greece. And Greece says, no more, we already have them. What's the answer to this? Well, the long answer, of course, is that people don't have to leave their countries and become refugees. The short answer is, if you don't want to create a big international crisis everywhere, and if you also don't want to breed terrorists everywhere, then you should seriously support the countries that have these refugees to manage them better. So if we want better relationships with Turkey, which is a kind of international actor for a variety of reasons that I'm about to mention, then we would say to Turkey, we're going to help you guys deal with this. We're going to pay for some of this. We're going to help you distribute some of these people, etc. But instead, we're doing none of it. We just sit around and criticize. Why isn't Turkey letting him in? Why isn't Greece letting him in? Greece has now violated its European Union legal obligation because, according to the EU, you have to at least allow asylum people to seek asylum. Well, of course, other places like Hungary haven't done that either. Have they gotten kicked out? No, they haven't. Is Greece going to get kicked out? Who knows? So the whole Syrian mess has become an international mess, which leads us to believe that Syria is a really important country, when actually it's not an important country. What's made it important is the conflict there and the role the international actors have played or not have played in Syria. So that's yet another category of my 6 or 7, which is sometimes countries are inherently not particularly important. They don't play a particular heavy global role, either economically, politically, or militarily. And then you have a conflict, you get a dictator, you have war, you have whatever, civil war and whatever, and all of a sudden a country which most people, I'm actually reasonably sure Trump couldn't find Syria on the map, but anyway, or to know where Turkey and Greece are. But for those of you who are Trump supporter, you can harass me afterwards. So all of a sudden, a country which was of no particular global moment, it might have been of regional moment, of one kind or another, becomes a globally important country not because of its leader just, but because it is the centerpiece of a nasty conflict with huge human rights violations of one kind or another, right? So a leader, an economy, the physical location, the geographic location of a country, all kinds of variables like that can catapult a country which is not inherently a major international actor to become the focus of major international actors and or to acquire major kind of leverage of one kind or another internationally, which it didn't enjoy before. So to look at the globe and say, well, you know, this is just a little country that's not really an important country, all of a sudden, for a variety of reasons, a little country can become important. Or a large country which never played any role can continue not to play any role or can all of a sudden become important. Brazil, again, is a good Brazil, not a really major international actor, boy, in the next 10 or 20 years, Brazil will be really important to the rest of us, of one kind or another. And having missed lots of countries, let me take the next few minutes and just talk about Europe. The European Union, as an economic bloc, is larger than the economy of the United States, if you count them all, okay? Also, in terms of population, they're larger now, of one kind or another. Insofar as the European Union will hang together and not only continue to revitalize and to move ahead, that is a major, the European Union as a European Union is a major actor for economic reasons, geographic reasons, military reasons, technological reasons, every reason that you can imagine. So if you add, after you leave Russia, China, and the United States, what would you look at as a major international actor? The European Union. But the European Union is, to some extent, fraying for one reason or another, excuse me, in part because you've got, Brexit and that craziness, but also because some of the East European countries like Hungary are not really buying into the principles of the European Union, right? Hungary could hardly be said as a democratic country with human rights and freedom of the press and all those things in the charter of the EU. The second thing is that one of the most powerful countries in the world, the United States, is powerful not just because of its military and economic might, but also because the dollar is the global currency, which we haven't really talked about. And the dollar, there are major efforts to reduce the importance of the dollar in world affairs. And one of the possibilities is the euro. But the euro has not really taken off as a counter currency. So the real question is, will in the next few years, under Christine Lagarde and other, the assault by Brexit on the European Union in some senses, the real disappointment in the United States and the loss of faith in the U.S., given our current administration and so forth, it may very well be that the euro will have an opportunity to rise into more prominence. Of course, the Chinese and the yen at various points have also said we could become a major currency, but that hasn't gone that far, and who knows about all of that in the future. So the European Union and the euro is potentially a very important international actor, which has countervailing possibilities to the United States anyway, to Russia for sure, maybe not China, but it could be a major actor. However, having said that, let me say the European Union has been at its most potent when it has had a leader, either an officer of the European Union or a person in head of state in Europe who took on major leadership. And that is also missing right now. I mean, Angela Merkel is in her waning days, and if you reel back 5 years, she was considered a world figure because she took stands on human rights, on international law, on democracy, on how the Europeans should treat refugees and all the rest. Okay, now that her star has faded, and none of her possible replacements look like major figures. They're sort of stuck like the U.S., right? No major figures running. Shouldn't say that, right? You have to vote anyway. And Macron, who theoretically could be a major force both for the EU and internationally, is so busy domestically right now that he doesn't have a lot of leverage. And no other European countries is headed by anybody who's a global figure. That we're devoid in Europe of the same thing that we're essentially devoid in many parts of the world. You have a lot of semi-competent heads of state, some of them pretty good in terms of their own country, but you don't have really major figures, which means that at the end of the day, you have Xi, you have Putin, and you have Trump. And that is not a very good combination for democracy and human rights and environment, and all the rest, right? So, does one throw in the towel and say the world is just hopelessly, confused and muddled? Well, who knows? Maybe in a year or two, somebody will arise, right? You have to be optimistic. But when you look at the leverage that small countries, big countries outside of the US, Russia, and the United States have, some play regional roles, some play local roles, some play global roles as countries. Some individuals from those countries take on leverage internationally for one reason or another. But it is not really possible to look at the world right now and say there's major leadership emerging on any continent anywhere in the world, which is, on the one hand, a very sad state of affairs. You could flip it around and saying, well, there's no major dictator that's also, a world figure or another one coming up. But we are living through a time when the existential threat to the world is tremendous, and where the pressure on democracy everywhere is tremendous, and where people want quick fixes, and where the younger generation is alienated and hostile. And we're living in that world in which you can go from continent to continent, and it's very hard to find major leadership of any kind. Break time. A third of you just went home to be depressed. And now I'm saying cheerful things. There's always the next generation. There's always things that happen that we didn't anticipate at all, like this, well, it was sort of anticipated with this virus. There's all this interesting stuff about globalization. How linked are we really? In terms of the virus, very linked. But in terms of other things, often delinked. So, questions? Yes?
You mentioned that Indonesia is destroying their forests, but they're a nation of hundreds of islands, and they're going to be one of the first to feel the effects of rising seas. Are they aware of that?
Oh, they're aware of it, and they're not doing very much of anything about it. In fact, even the Little Rising Sea is already putting some of Jakarta, which is also very low. The water's beginning to rise, so you have a situation like Venice right now in parts of Jakarta. Yes. Well, doing something about it is, A, expensive, and B, you have to have a mind to do it. New York City decided they better build barriers outside in the water so as New York's Manhattan not to get drowned out when the sea level raises. And they had plans and architects and so forth. I think it was last week that the federal government decided to take away the funds for that. That's a very wise thing to do. Yeah. Yeah, right. The Dutch tried to help Louisiana after the hurricane and the water rising, and the Dutch specialist on how you build when you're on water volunteered help to the U.S., and it was declined. We said we didn't need any help. We have our own army of engineers, and we don't need the Dutch or their experience. Our arrogance is often quite profound. Yes, sir? Oh, the BRIC countries. I see, yes. Are they a counterweight? No, because they're not getting their act together. I mean, theoretically, you could get groupings of countries to organize, but none of that is working very well. I mean, the irony of the contemporary period, on the one hand, you have this globalization, right? You can't probably buy a new iPhone because the parts are not coming and all the rest of it. On the other hand, the various institutions of cooperation, regional institutions, global institutions, and so forth, are all fraying. for lack of leadership. And so, whether it's formal as an institution or informal alliances, none of them seem to be working very well. And I don't know that I have, anything very coherent to say about it, except that most countries in the world right now are suffering from populism on the right and the left. And whether it's populism on the right or the left, it's counterindicated for these more intimate alliances and leverages and institutions, right? So the Bernie that everybody loves to love, the young generation, right? He's against free trade. He's against all the various trade agreements and so forth. Well, think about it for a minute. You may be a Bernie fan, but think about it for a minute. What allows smooth globalization is arrangements that don't need daily renegotiations and are not open to the weather of that morning. And so these various alliances, the formalized trade agreements and so forth, and institutions like the World Trade Organization, which manage violations or are supposed to manage violations, are a way to allow globalization to take place. So on the one hand, populists are at some sort of level in favor of globalization, but actually are nationalists of the right and the left. And the more nationalism comes to the fore, the less likely the leaders of countries are either authorized or able, even if they would themselves be on the right side of this issue, to do anything about it. Which is one of the things, of course, that undermines Macron. Right? Macron has this idea about the importance of the European Union and globalization and climate change and so forth. And he's stuck with these populists on both sides, marching in the streets and all of that. And under the circumstances, he has very little leverage, even if he would get reelected or stay in office, very little leverage to say, never mind, gazing at our own navel about the various retirement programs and all the rest. We need to think more globally. He's not in the position to do that, right? And so, and it's not just a question of the right, it's also a question of the left. I mean, if you carefully examine Bernie Sanders' plan, it's all good things for us all, right? We're going to have good health care and whatever. We're going to spend less on the military. Well, maybe, good luck. But we certainly are against some of this globalization, and we're certainly against all this free trade and so on. And so the globalization, the formalized globalization structure is fraying and eroding. For example, the World Trade Organization, I talked to that before. We're not funding it. We're opposed to it. We're not allowing it to work. We, meaning the United States. So that's happening on the one side. And on the other side, even more informal arrangements like the BRICS, right, are in a difficult position to get together and unify on things because the national ethos is one of nationalism. Let's do our own thing. Yes. So the question is, isn't, globalization fraying? Isn't the virus, demonstrating that you can't just move around and let's have more rigid borders, let's keep strangers out, and so on. Lots to be said about that. I mean, first of all, I would say globalization is here to stay. That's number one, of one kind or another. You can't put the genie back in the bottle of having rigid national borders. A small country here or there can do it. And just let's think about ourselves, right? Many of us enjoy traveling. Okay, it's one thing to say we're not going to Milan tomorrow. It's another thing to say, even if we cancel our trip to Milan, I'm never going to go to Italy, I'm never going to go to Europe, I'm never going to go to China, I'm never going to do anything. I'm just going to stay in the United States and maybe just Santa Cruz, right? Maybe we don't even want to go to Aptos. They're, Given modern communications, given the distribution of goods, services, and all the rest. Not to mention natural resources. I mean, there are very few countries that are self-sufficient. You know, we say, well, we're a big country, we're self-sufficient. Yeah, where exactly do you get your coffee from? You know? So I think nationalism can increase in certain countries, and nasty things can happen, and institutions can erode. But to go back to, you know, some other century, where, you know, self-contained countries more or less have rigid borders, and what are you going to have? You're going to have walls, Trump-like walls around every country, you know? And we're going to build a wall between ourselves and Canada? How exactly is that going to work? So I just think that people get hysterical about, on the one hand, the positives of globalization, and on the other hand, the negatives of globalization. The hystericals about the positive of globalization was that people discounted how much people do live in their own culture and their own society and speaking their own languages, right? So the idea that some people had, oh, now we're moving into some kind of world government, which, by the way, has always been a bad idea, I think. But any of you World Federalists? Because they're World Federalist Association. I even gave a talk at Carmel or something to the World Federalists. It's total cuckoo's will, right? We're all going to speak Esperanto, and we're going to have a world government. Well, we don't even like the UN or the Security Council or regional organizations to make decisions for us. Can you imagine what a world government sitting in Luxembourg or someplace is going to look like? I mean, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So, on the one hand, people, because of globalization, have recognized that they value their own culture, their own language, and the rest of it. On the other hand, having said that, how far is it going to push to really kind of nasty nationalism? Okay, I mean, nationalism supposedly was going to fray, right, after the Second World War. Well, it hasn't frayed. If anything, it's strengthened. Right? We are Americans. We're not English. We're really different from the English, right? Well, never mind the Brazilians and the Chinese and all the rest of it. So nationalism and a sense of that local life makes sense is strengthening. Whether that means simultaneously you have to close your border, you have to knock down all international institutions and all that. That's really where the issue lies. How much of that do you want to erode in order to feel that you're Americans and you're different than the Japanese or whatever? Right? It's a difficult question, and the balance for countries is difficult. Somebody raised during the break, but when the Poles, when you say, you know, how can Poland, being a member of the European Union, not allow refugees in? And their response is, of course, we have gazillions of refugees. They come from the Ukraine. So of course we accept refugees. You then get to a different kind of issue, and the issue is one of race and ethnicity, right? And obviously in a globalized world, people will move around. But are you willing to live in a more heterogeneous society? A lot of countries are quite homogeneous. Look what's happening in Burma. Look what's happening in India. It's religion. So ethnicity, religion, language, all of those things have historically all had political implications, both nationally and internationally. And so then the question is, how out of control is that going to be? And particular for us in the United States, I mean, we have always believed ourselves to be able to incorporate people from different backgrounds. And now we're freaking out, not we necessarily, we're freaking out. Yeah, people from different backgrounds was fine as long as people were Italian and Irish. But now that people are people of color, it's not so fine. Well, I've said this before, so I don't want to bore you. The fact of the matter was, even in the 1950s, the discrimination against Italians and Irish, let's say in New York City, was huge, right? And we got used to. So at least the white barriers have stopped. Now it's people of color. And of course, in most countries, including our own, people of European origin will be the minority. That's going to be true everywhere in the world because of the population of the world. Of the whatever 8 billion, whatever we're going to, the majority of people are not white people with European origin. So friends, get used to it. Get your grandkids used to it, right? That does not mean people can't have things in common, but they will look different. And of course, this virus business is also resurrecting racial stuff because you don't particularly want to be Chinese, even if you're multiple generation American walking in certain neighborhoods right now, because people will think that you might be carrying the virus because you look Chinese. Yeah, I was going to say, I've never been to China. I'm third generation Chinese in California. What do you mean? You might carry the virus. I might carry it, but not because I've been to China. So racism, identifiable visual racism, very easily raises its head. But it doesn't even have to be that. It can just be religion. I mean, look in the Middle East, Shiites, Sunni, Jews, non-Jews. I mean, it's a mess. And that is exactly why national leaders and international leaders need to take leadership in it. And what I'm saying is there's a paucity of people who will stand up for reasonable values right now. And the populists on the left, who appeal to many of us because at least they're not right-wing nutcases. They're just left-wing nutcases. You've got to listen to them carefully because in many ways they share this notion of separatism, isolationism, non-international, Bernie Sanders, I'm sure, will be happy to say we don't have to pay attention to the Security Council. Right? Who are those people telling us what to do? I'm in favor of labor and whatever in the United States. What about international labor? What about the labor that is done in Thailand, let's say, or Bangladesh to produce our clothing? Well, that's a simple fix. We're not going to if you're left, we're not going to take advantage of that anymore. We're going to produce it all at home. Yeah, sure, your grandchildren are going to work in textile factories earning $10 an hour. I mean, it's just think it through. It is crazy. It is absolutely crazy what is being said, both right and left, if you unspool it. Superficially, some of it sounds fine, but it doesn't make any sense. So I think because it doesn't make any sense, it will be overridden by reality. Right? Climate reality will have to set in. You can deny it until hell freezes over. The fact is, it's going to come and people will have to deal with it. Ethnic mix will have to come. You're going to have to find other ways to cope. So in that sense, it's actually a positive message. That is to say, we're in a very bad space right now. But there's reason to believe that people aren't stupid. And when the water starts drifting into your house, you might get the general idea, or 19 people or whatever die in Tennessee in a tornado that wasn't expected. You might begin to think, well, maybe, I should think about this. This has some implications. Yes?
In terms of facing reality, one of the things that I hear, and I'm wondering if you speak to it, there is this kind of universal drawbridge phenomenon, the desire that when there seems to be fear and problems out in the country, people run to the castle, and the people in the castle, that would be the United States in this case, pull up the drawbridge, right? Quick, before there's too many. That combined with the fact that we do have probably, I think it's a fact, we have overpopulation worldwide. There's too many people. And therefore, shouldn't we be helping them? And see, you're going to say this is racist. No, I'm talking about everybody to practice some form of birth control.
Yeah, it's a naughty how about, isn't the world getting overpopulated? And, you know, then you bring down drawbridges, but the world is overpopulated, therefore people want to move, it's more difficult to feed people, the attack on the environment will be greater, and all the rest of it. In general, demographers have pointed out over the last 50 years that people reduce the number of children they have voluntarily through birth control and whatever, if they get more affluent and if they get more urban. 80% of the world will be people will be living in urban environments in this century. Right? And countries, already some of the countries in Africa and elsewhere, 60% of the population already live in urban areas. So urbanization will make a difference. People becoming better educated will make a difference. In the 60s and 70s, demographers did some research in Indonesia and elsewhere where they demonstrated that 4 years of elementary school education of women half the number of children they have. 4 years of education, that's all it takes. So, educating women, urbanization, climate change, all kinds of things can have an impact. Major impact, and I think it will in this century. The problem is, we're talking fertility rates at this point. Fertility rates are the number of children a woman has during her life, reproductive years. Population growth rate is what's in the pipeline. So if, for example, a woman has 8 children, and each of those children only have 2 offspring, you still have a huge population increase. So to slow down population, short of people drowning or dying of nuclear conflict, it will take a generation, even under the best of circumstances, to slow down population growth. So what people need to work on right now is fertility rates and the various things we know about reducing fertility in order, towards the end of the century, to have a reduced population growth rate. So it's a very complicated business, because you look at the statistics and you keep on saying, the population of Nigeria is about to double in the next 10 years. Well, it will double in the next 10 years, even if Nigerians per woman only have 1 child, you know what I mean? Because there are all these people in the pipeline. So it's a long-term and difficult issue. From the perspective of policy, of course, birth control and supporting birth control and reproductive education, even if you don't believe in birth control, is really, really very vital. And in the United States used to be in its aid programs in favor of doing something, but then of course we stopped, and we certainly stopped under this administration as well, for religious reasons, right? If you're going to get the evangelical right to support you, if you're Trump, you're certainly not going to have USAID policies, right, which are family planning policies, right? So then the other question is, of course, the mortality rate. And because healthcare, we've talked about this before, since healthcare has gotten so much better, people in even the shithole countries live longer because medical circumstances are better for them, right? So the part is not just that people are reproducing and having many children, it's also that the population lives longer, and so in all countries you have an aging population, and that essentially has a different kind of problem, which is many countries in the world, in Europe, it's going to happen in the US very soon, is aging out. And by aging out, it means there are not enough workers of working age in the society, which means people have to move, right? Farmers in California, Republican Central Valley farmers, are screaming bloody murder for workers. They California produces whatever, 80% of the country's vegetables or fruits or whatever. I think 100% of all almonds, and we're all supposed to eat almonds, right? So where are you going to get the workers from? You're going to get the workers from countries which have surplus labor or labor that is not paid enough, which is more reason why you have to allow people to move. You allow people to move to harvest in the Central Valley, and God knows they have a child. That child is American. If you're the Trump administration, you kick them out. The choice that worker has is to leave their kids behind in the U.S. by themselves. Happens a lot these days. And or they take the kid back and they go to wherever they are. So a flexible global labor market is absolutely essential. It is so essential in Europe that it's even beyond the U.S., right, so you have problems on both ends. You have to slow down population growth, right? You have an aging population, which means you have to move the population around the world to have viable economies. So it's much more complex in some odd way than people imagine. Having fewer children is not necessarily the fix. If by fewer children you mean what many American middle-class women are doing is not having any children. It's a very bad idea. Should have at least 1 or 2 children. Speak I, who did not have children. Long-winded answer. Sorry. Yes, sir.
What do you think the chances of Ireland getting reunited to the whole island are?
I think they're pretty good, but not instantly. I think that the Catholic population outnumbers the Protestant population in Northern Ireland. I think that there's every reason to believe that the Irish complexity of dealing with the Brexit situation will foster that. The problem is that, as you probably, if you read the New York Times or something, the problem is that in the Republic of Ireland, the most serious problem is a housing problem. It's like Santa Cruz. And unless the housing problem is resolved very quickly by the now IRA head of government, there's certain irony in that, right? Sinn Féin. That they will be hesitant because people in the North are poorer than people in the Republic, and so some of them will want to move to the Republic of Ireland, and that will create even more of a housing crisis. So I think there's a break on that happening very quickly, but I think it's going to happen. Sure. Yes. Sensible. Yes, sir.
You say a little bit about nuclear proliferation. One would think that the countries that have the capability do not want other countries to get it, and yet China props up North Korea.
Yes, Russia has actually been quite good over the years about all of this, which is being on the same page with the United States in terms of being opposed to proliferation. And the various treaties, missiles, starts, whatever, all those treaties were very welcome on the part of the Soviet Union and then Russia, because it had it lent a feel of control between the two nuclear powers and also allowed for more leverage against smaller fry who want to get nuclear weapons. As you probably know, the Trump administration has unspooled all of that. We're not re-signing up on those treaties, so the Russians are moving out on to develop new nuclear capacities, new missiles, and all the rest of it. And, of course, we are putting more and more money in the military to also modernize it. And that gives us less leverage with the smaller fry saying, don't touch this stuff. So our U.S. policy on this, which used to be fairly joint with the Russians, which was a good thing, has now unraveled, and that may very well lead not just to the Russians helping X and Y, and of course the Pakistanis are also helping countries. And given the mess that we've created with our relationship with Iran, which is worth talking about again some other time, which is a total disaster, if Iran further develops its nuclear capacity, you better believe that the Saudis will come to the U.S. and say, help us develop it, and that then raises conflicts with the Russians. So it's not just Russia versus the United States and China and North Korea. It's Iran, it's Pakistan, it's a potential in the Middle East. Of course, Israel has nuclear capacity. They're saying, well, they have it, why can't we have it? So it's getting, I think, in the years to come, unless the current pattern, unless we get some president who will say to the Russians, let's get back to the table and renegotiate all of this. I don't even know whether you can backtrack on it, but if you could backtrack on it, that would help a lot, because nuclear proliferation, of course, well, that's one way of population control, right? We wipe out lots of people. But the more countries have nuclear capacity, the more likely that there's an accident, right? So that's it. Yes, ma'am.
Talking about weapons and so forth, our country, the U.S., sells a lot of arms around the world to various countries. And I was wondering, how big is that? I know he just negotiated a big deal with India of arming them.
Right. We're the biggest arms salespersons in the world. There's Russia, there's France, there are other countries, but China now, North Korea, but we're the biggest arms merchant. A very large chunk of maintaining our arms industry is based on international sales. And, lots of us have been against that since the beginning. What kind of arms are we selling? Often the arms were not the state-of-the-art of, let's say, missiles and so forth, but we're now going to do that. That is to say, anybody who wants to pay the U.S. It's a big industry. It's very dependent on international sales. It's not clear that the U.S. is at the forefront in all aspects in terms of the sales. Countries have gotten smart, for example, and decided not to order certain American hardware because it's cheaper and better coming from somewhere else. So the arms industry is having some difficulties here and there. Look at Boeing. I mean, Boeing doesn't just do, planes for Southwest Airlines. Boeing is also a major military aircraft producer. So let's take Boeing. Boeing is losing contracts in Europe. People are buying their hardware somewhere else. So the market, I guess, without belaboring it, the market has become quite diffuse. But the U.S. arms industry is very dependent on it. Okay, and last time I mentioned landmines because we're, for the first time since the landmine treaty, going back in the business of making landmines. You better believe we're going to sell those because it's not worthwhile for the industry to only produce landmines for the U.S. So once we produce more of these sophisticated landmines, somebody's going to come along and want to buy some of them, and we're going to sell them. What else can I say? Am I against it? Yes. Does what I'm for or against matter? No. But it does matter who the administration is. It does matter who Congress is, because Congress very often, believe it or not, allocates more funds for military hardware to be sold overseas than even the executive branch. That's if the executive branch may, let's say $50 million, and Congress says, how about $75 million? And of course, the industry lobbies Congress to get to the $75 million. So part of the U.S. lobbying effort is to escalate the industry, which is very powerful in Washington. There are arms industry people running all over the place in everybody's congressman and senator's office. And so this is, I don't know, some of you, and the thing is, what's military and what's not military in the U.S. is sort of on a sliding scale, because we imagine Boeing to produce airplanes for Southwest. We don't think about its military stuff. We imagine computing stuff to be essentially our laptops and our iPhones, but it's also security stuff and spying stuff and stuff that's needed for drones, for example. This business of killing people with drones, which God knows was started by Obama, right, ought to be reversed. Because the whole drone industry and the whole idea of doing international politics and military things by drones is just really, really dangerous. It's going to come back to haunt us because lots of countries will get the capacity to have drones. So it's a crazy business. That should be put back into the safe. So, yeah, I don't have a good answer except that some of you may have children and grandchildren who are working in industries that don't sound like their arms industry, but much of what they in fact do is necessary for the arms industry. Yes?
Are there any international organizations thinking about what happens when hundreds of millions of people can't live where they live right now and they need to find a new home?
That's a very good question. I mean, insofar as they are organizations that are supposed to deal with people who can no longer, for one reason or another, could be political, environmental, live, there is a UN agency called the International Refugee Organization, which at various times has done very good work and is doing, as we speak, very good work in providing shelters and food and so forth for refugees. Are they plotting, or is any alternative organization plotting of what happens when millions of people have to move? I think the answer is basically no. That is to say, there's some academics thinking about it, there's some philosophers thinking about it, there's some environmentalists thinking about it, but is there an effective thing out there which is saying, okay, supposing everybody, half the population of Bangladesh has to move, now what do we do? Is there any really advanced thinking, or is there a lot of advanced thinking going into that? I don't think so. I mean, maybe somewhere, but...
And what's your personal thought?
As to what should be done about it?
Yeah, I mean, we are a big country. I mean, there's a lot of room still, for example.
Yes, there's a lot of room here. There's a lot of room in Canada. People will have to be resettled. Most people want to be resettled in their own culture. And increasingly in various parts of the world, including some urban areas in the U.S., people are building up where you can build up, where it's safe, rather than building across. So housing will fundamentally have to change. How housing is built into swamp areas. I mean, after all, this is no global fix, but just an illustration. The Dutch know how to build buildings that can rise with the sea. And they are not building any new buildings that can't rise for 3 meters or whatnot within the sea. This can be done. Right? And architects, actually, what groups are working on this sort of thing? Architects and architectural firms. But then you have to be willing to say, we've got to do this. Never mind the world out there, look at the U.S. Is Florida really prepared? Is Manhattan really prepared? You don't even have to go to Bangladesh. Right? And if half the population of Florida has to move, well, we're a big country, we can move them. But the problematic of moving that many people and reintegrating them in other economies is profound. So I think it's in part a scientific question, and an engineering question, and an architectural question, and an environmental question, and, all hands on deck. There is no uniform quick fix. There's not a solution. There are gazillions of solutions in different countries under different circumstances. Will lots of people probably get killed? Yes. Well, we have too many people in the world anyway. That's fine if they're not your relatives, right? But, so, anybody else? Shall we go home? What can I do to cheer you up? So, I have one request, and that is my email is Ronnie, RONNIE, at UCSC.edu. And if any of you have wishes and desires for next fall of topics that you would like me to cover, feel free to email me, and I will pay close attention and try to incorporate them, okay? Meantime, happy spring and summer. Thank you.